Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this webinar entitled The Role of Free Trade Agreements in Promoting Sustainable Business and Human Rights. My name is Charlene Tan. I'm the Project Coordinator for the Business for Human Rights and Environment in Malaysia platform, and I will be your MC for today. This event is brought to you by BCSD Malaysia and our event partner, the Raoul Wallenberg Institute, RWI. I wish to start by thanking all attendees for spending your afternoon here with us today. I also want to thank all of our distinguished speakers who have agreed to join us today. We will introduce them one by one in a few moments. Ladies and gentlemen, before we start today, let me give a brief introduction of who we are. BCSD Malaysia is a CEO-led non-profit organization formed by a group of forward-thinking companies committed to creating a sustainable future for business, society, and the environment. We are the global network partner in Malaysia of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, WBCSD. Together with our members, we want to drive systems transformation that is essential to transition to a world where 9 billion people can live comfortably within the planetary boundaries by the year 2050. At the same time, we strive to make more sustainable businesses more successful. Like WBCSD, we work with businesses mostly around 6 main program areas where systems transformation is needed. As you can see here, they are circular economy, cities and mobility, climate and energy, food and nature, social issues and human rights, and reporting and governance. In these areas, we initiate projects with concrete and measurable output. They all take a science-based approach and they aim for targeted business solutions to scale up business impact. WBCSD also has a number of active projects at the global level. There are hundreds of local projects from the 62 WBCSD global network partners around the world, like BCSD Malaysia and the BCSDs in the region that you can see here in this slide. The knowledge generated through our global or local projects is used to initiate or to replicate projects in some other parts of the world. This approach leverages on our successes and it minimizes wasting time and resources trying to reinvent the wheel. So ladies and gentlemen, trade agreements have long served as an incentive for trade and transactions between countries. In the context of human rights and the environment, trade agreements now have a much larger role to play beyond commercial interests, encouraging the parties involved to comply with a set of conditions in the interest of long-term cooperation. Recent years have seen a push towards the right direction of incorporating human rights and environmental concerns into the drafting of such treaties, but more effort needs to be made to ensure compliance on all levels of supply chain if we want to work towards a sustainable future. As new provisions on human rights, the environment, and sustainable development incorporated in FTAs globally begin to impact supply chain governance, businesses can no longer overlook the power of trade and investments agreements in the region. Now more than ever, the Malaysian business sector needs to step up their game. So for today, our esteemed speakers will be providing an overview on the free trade and investment agreements in the Asia region, their provisions on human rights and the environment, and will be highlighting key challenges in improving supply chain governance to comply with trade agreements. This will then be followed by a moderated panel discussion on the implications of FTAs on business and human rights. And before we move on, just allow me to share with you a couple of housekeeping items and then we can begin. The whole proceeding of this webinar is being recorded. The participants will be kept on mute during the webinar. However, if you have questions or any comments, please feel free to type it in during the webinar in the Q&A section or the chat box. There will be a moderated panel discussion following the speaker presentations where we will address these questions at the end of the panel depending on our time constraints. And once again, this webinar is part of a series of learning sessions organized between BCSD Malaysia and the Raoul Wallenberg Institute for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law. Through this partnership, we want to be able to offer Malaysian businesses first-class training and support on tackling human rights and environment-related issues. Now, without further ado, Let us start the event with a welcome address by the founding chairman of BCSD Malaysia, Professor Tan Sri Dr. Zakri Abdul Hamid. Professor Tan Sri Dr. Zakri is the founding chairman of BCSD Malaysia. He's also ambassador and science advisor to the Campaign for Nature, former UN official, and a senior fellow of the Academy of Sciences Malaysia, as well as a member of the Prime Minister's Malaysian Climate Change Action Council. Until 2016, he served as the founding chair at the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services as the science advisor to Malaysia's Prime Minister, and was one of 26 members of the UN Secretary General's Scientific Advisory Board. We give a warm welcome to Professor Tan Sri Dr. Zakri to deliver the welcome address to officiate this event. Over to you, Tan Sri.
Thank you, Charlene, for that generous introduction. Let me, at the outset, address Mr. Roberto Benitello, the CEO of BCSD Malaysia, our dear friend, EU Ambassador to Malaysia, His Excellency Michaelis Rokas, distinguished participants. Welcome to our webinar this afternoon. I am very delighted and honored to be here to be part of this interesting and timely webinar. Ladies and gentlemen, as Charlene also mentioned in opening remarks, trade agreements have long served as an incentive to trade and transaction between countries. Through tariffs, quotas, and other agreed clauses, they encourage the parties involved to comply with a set of conditions in the interest of long-term cooperation. In the context of human rights and the environment, trade agreements now have a much larger role to play beyond commercial interests. Incorporating sustainability clauses into trade agreements can incentivize cooperation or compliance with labor rights. This affects not just business or policymakers, but the millions of workers and consumers linked in one way or another to production and supply chain. Ladies and gentlemen, recent years have seen a push towards the right direction of incorporating human rights and environmental concerns into the drafting of such treaties. But more efforts needs to be made to ensure compliance on all levels of supply chain if we want to work towards a sustainable future. With the COVID-19 pandemic highlighting severe red flags in the way businesses overlook non-compliance issues, increased attention is being put on countries and their cooperation with sustainability clauses in such treaties. In the EU, for example, there is increased commitment to human rights and democracy in new free trade agreements. In the US, human and labor rights provisions are being included in the latest agreements as well. It is encouraging to see such commitment at the top level of policy making, and there is still room for improvement. More dialogue and cooperation on human rights is needed to ensure that fair treatment is given to all parties. Businesses, I believe, could do with more awareness on the issue, the importance of complying with sustainable clauses and provisions, and take concrete steps to reforming their supply chains for the sake of compliance. Supply chains governance ought to be re-examined in the context of human rights and the environment to align local businesses with the same level of commitment and at the international level. I can say Malaysia is a bit behind on many of these issues. For instance, this past year alone has already seen a series of blows faced by Malaysian businesses, such as by the manufacturing sector, as human rights violations and forced labor allegations surfaced rapidly during the COVID-19 pandemic. Lax regulations and non-compliance throughout supply chain have resulted in no-buy orders or backlash from the international community. And actions that we took in response to these allegations fall short of achieving long-term sustainability goals. Ladies and gentlemen, no longer can local businesses overlook the power of trade and investment agreements on the region. The new provisions on human rights, environment, and sustainable development incorporated in FTAs globally will have impact on supply chain governance. And now, more than ever, the Malaysian business sector needs to step up the game in responsible supply chain governance. So at BCSD Malaysia, we are committed to creating a sustainable future for business, society, and the environment. As the global network partner in Malaysia of the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, or WBCSD, together with our increasing membership, we strive to make more sustainable business more successful. At the same time, as part of our goals for Vision 2050, we want to drive systems transformation, which is essential to transition to a world where 9.5 billion people can live well within the planetary boundaries by 2050. BCSD Malaysia, together with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, welcome you today to this session. The role of free trade agreements in promoting sustainable business and human rights. To our esteemed speakers and experts, we thank you for your meaningful contribution to the ongoing discourse on business and human rights. And to all our attendees, we thank you for being here with us today. Your engagement with the Business for Human Rights and the Environment platform is important and significant to us and to the society. I look forward to the speakers' session and the panel discussion. So to end, once again, welcome and thank you very much. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you very much to Professor Dr. Tan Sri Zakri for the welcome address as well. Now we will invite our special guest for today, His Excellency Michalis Rokas, the Ambassador and Head of the EU Delegation to Malaysia, to deliver an opening keynote. Let me just share his bio as well. So His Excellency is the Head and Ambassador of the EU Delegation to Malaysia. He has 26 years of experience in foreign affairs, having joined the European Commission External Relations Directorate General in 1994. Even from 2016 to April 2017, he's worked briefly as advisor to the Director General on the Budget and Administration at the EEAS. We are honored to have him here today, so let us give him a warm welcome to the Ambassador to deliver the opening keynote for today. Ambassador, if you please.
Thank you, Charlene, and thank you to Tan Sri, Dr. Zakri, and Roberto, and the Business Council for Sustainable Development for inviting me to open this important and very timely webinar. You know, it is the third time this week that I would speak about the environment and social governance and responsible business conduct. This Wednesday at the National Conference on Business and Human Rights organized by UNEP with the support of the European Union, and yesterday at the Cooler Earth Summit co-organized by WWF and Sim Bank. I think this proves that the debate is ongoing here in Malaysia about awareness, ethics, trade best practices, but also sustainable supply chains and how we can make a difference for what people now increasingly ask. They want the products, they want our trade to be based on sustainable practices. So again, warm welcome to the panelists and to the audience that join us today. I would say a few words about trade and sustainable development and free trade agreements that the European Union has negotiated or is negotiating. But I also would like to refer to the actions and proposals that the European Union is undertaking on its own initiative to promote sustainability. This is what we call, from our side, open strategic autonomy, which impacts, of course, all trade partners, including Malaysia, with which we do not have an FTA yet. Maybe it is there to come. To set the scene, I would say that sustainability is a key element of the European Union in negotiation of all free trade agreements. The EU's modern FTAs aim to ensure that the benefits of trade to the economic growth go hand in hand with social cohesion and environmental protection. So why is that? Well, what is the thinking behind the EU legislators' action? The European Union consumers want to reap the benefits of having access to global markets through FTAs. But also, this is normal, everybody wants to do that. But on the top, more and more, they want to know, first, where the products they buy come from. But second, and I will underline that, under which conditions those products are produced. So EU consumers, to give you an example, do not want textiles made with forced labor. They do not want to buy furniture based on illegally harvested timber. Or they don't want to have for the dinner table fish illegally caught. What we call in the European Union trade and sustainable development chapters in our free trade agreements are already playing a vital role in this respect. The most modern FTAs, or the latest FTAs we negotiated, they include binding commitments from our partners to ratify and effectively implement all fundamental ILO conventions and multinational environmental agreements, such as the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. But in addition to those commitments, our partners are expected to give additional commitments on sustainable forestry management, biodiversity, and sustainable fishing, to name a few. And indeed, these are unique features of EU trade agreements. And I'm pretty sure that the next speaker, Dr. Axel Marx, will tell you more about the achievements and challenges of what we call EU value-based trade policy. And also maybe I can add to that, all this is always a work in process, because even our free trade agreements that we consider them to be very strong on sustainability, they can always be improved, and I'm very positive in that regard. So signing free trade agreements with the European Union is one thing. Implementing, of course, is another. So that's why we are taking important steps to improve the enforcement of existing agreements. Internally, we have established a position of a chief trade enforcement officer in order to ensure that commitments are indeed fulfilled. There is not empty words. And of course, we are seeing results. Let me name a few examples. For example, Vietnam has ratified conventions on collective bargaining which is ILO Convention number 98, and on forced labor, which is number 105. Vietnam has issued a new labor code. With our free trade agreement that we have with Korea, with the Republic of Korea, Korea has also ratified 3 of the 4 remaining core ILO conventions as recently as this year. So it has been important widely, this fact in the media, and that the discussions on effective implementation also of the Paris Agreement are at the heart of the ratification of, for example, our deal with Mercosur. So I have told you what we do with FTAs. The thing is what we do with everyone else that we do not have FTAs. So currently the European Union has 46 free trade agreements in place. And on the top of that, we have a system that we call the generalized scheme of preferences for low and lower middle income countries that could benefit from preferential access to the European Union market in terms of partial or full removal of custom duties. And for least developed countries, they can also benefit, the benefits that go even further, to complete duty-free, quota-free access for all products except arms and ammunition. It is what we call is another EU tool that we use, and it's called Everything But Arms, or EBA. Let me give you some updates. 2 days ago, the European Commission proposed a revision of the general scheme of preference to reinforce the scheme's social, labor, environmental, and climate dimension. Let me give an example. Before, or let's say beyond the core human rights and labor conventions that we cover them, the proposal now incorporates environmental and good governance conditions and introduces the possibility to withdraw the benefits for serious and systemic violations of the principles of the international conventions. So what do we do with countries that we trade, of course, and we do not have a free trade agreement, but also they do not fall under those schemes, the GSP, the General Scheme of Preference, or the Everything But Arms initiative, like Malaysia. So here is where what I referred earlier in my speech comes our open strategic autonomy. So the European Union has set rules and measures on responsible business conduct to establish due diligence obligations on importance of various products such as timber, minerals, diamonds, and fish. These obligations apply to EU importers regardless of the existence of a free trade agreement with the country of origin. Maybe you have heard the message from the Commission President last week at the presentation of the State of the Union at the European Parliament, that, and it was a quite loud and clear message, that there should be no place in the European Union for goods made under forced labor. The European Commission, therefore, will propose legislation by the end of this year targeting mandatory due diligence of supply chains, and especially targeting forced labor. So the sustainable corporate governance legislation, as we are going to call it, should introduce mandatory human rights, environmental due diligence for EU companies and their supply chains. In July already this year, in order to bridge the gap between today and the adoption of the legislation, the European Commission issued what we call a voluntary guidance for companies on forced labor in order to raise awareness and to support companies in the implementation of already existing international standards on due diligence. On the environmental front, maybe you have heard that the European Union's Green Deal and the recently adopted EU climate law with binding commitments to achieve net zero emission in the EU by 2050 and reducing our emissions in 2030 to 55% compared to the levels in 1990. It is important that I mention that because it makes part of sustainable business. So among the various elements of this package, you might have heard the fight against carbon leakage under our proposed carbon border adjustment mechanism, and increase carbon sinks by avoiding deforestation, including avoiding the import of products linked to deforestation. So all these things are very relevant, of course, to Malaysia, and it is not only a stick approach, but there is also a carrot approach, because we cooperate closely and fund international bodies such as the ILO, the OECD, the United Nations that work on sustainability. In Malaysia, we have many initiatives. We support the government, the Ministry of Justice, in drafting the country's national action plan on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights through a project implemented by the United Nations Development Program. And we have also recently launched another project that will focus on the tripartite dialogue on sustainability, supply chain in the Malaysian rubber sector together with the ILO. Moreover, we are in contact with the business community and the industry associations, inviting them to ensure that decent working conditions for staff, exactly to avoid that there are no legal bans from the EU, but certainly boycotts from the consumers. So I hope this sort of illustration of sustainability in the EU and trade agreements and the EU delegations activities that I have honor also to head, our activities on the ground set the scene for this event. As very rightly Dr. Zachary said, Malaysia faces several challenges, but we want to partner with Malaysia to address those challenges. And I think our actions here, we can mobilize funds together with various associations, but also with the European Chamber of Commerce to enhance the corporate social responsibility and make sure that we eliminate gradually all issues or notions of forced labor or unsustainable and unethical business practices in our supply chains. Therefore, I stop here and I want to congratulate again the Business Council for Sustainable Development for the organization of this series, and I wish you a very successful and fruitful discussion and deliberation. Thank you.
A huge thank you to His Excellency for that informative and meaningful keynote. Thank you very much for sharing as well on the EU approach on all these modern FTAs. This really makes a point, I think, on how adopting sustainable business practices will prove to be beneficial in the long run, for greater cooperation as well for businesses and companies that are working as well as looking forward to working with the EU. We are truly, truly honored to have you today with us to share this opening keynote. Now let us move on to the next session, where we will have our speakers to share on fostering responsible trade practices and sustainable supply chains. Let me just get my screen up again. Set up and working. There we go. So the first session today with our speakers would be fostering responsible trade practices and sustainable supply chains. And our first speaker is Dr. Axel Marx, Deputy Director of the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies. Dr. Axel here today will be sharing with us the EU's value-based trade policy and human rights, achievements and challenges. His research interests include inter alia voluntary sustainability standards, sustainable development, business and human rights, and EU trade policy. He has acted as a consultant to several national and international governmental organizations, including the European Parliament and the European Commission. He's also published widely on the EU trade policy in several academic journals and has co-edited a research handbook on business and human rights, which will appear next year. So now we'll invite Dr. Axel to share with us his perspectives. The floor is yours, Dr. Axel.
Thank you very much, Charlene. If you will, can you allow me to share my screen?
Yes, let me just do that.
So thank you very much for inviting me to this very distinguished panel, and also to speak on the EU's approach towards promoting human rights through trade policy. And I think my contribution will build very nicely on the introduction by Ambassador Rokas, who already set the scene on how the EU is approaching human rights and sustainable development in its free trade agreements, and why it's so important for the EU to do so. In my short introduction, I will try to provide you a little bit with a more in-depth overview of how the EU is approaching this. We already heard from Ambassador Rokas some of these elements. And then I want to build a little bit on this to also maybe introduce some of the current debates we are having in Europe on the current approach of the EU, and also some of the ideas the Commission is actually proposing to strengthen the current approach, especially with regard to the trade and sustainable development chapters in EU trade agreements, of which we just heard. Maybe just allow me briefly to set a scene and actually build a bit on what we also just heard from Ambassador Rokas. Commission President von der Leyen in her State of the Union made a very strong plea on the importance of having values, human rights-based values, sustainable development values in all of its EU policies and also in EU trade policy. And here you see on the slide a quote by the President of the European Council, Charles Michel, when he spoke to the General Assembly last year. And he also stressed that more than ever, he said, the European Union is defending the rules-based international order and cooperation based on universal values. And a bit further in his speech, he really linked that idea to the importance of also integrating that into trade. And they tried to stress that let's say, the inclusion of human rights concerns, labor rights concerns, environmental concerns in trade policy will be ever more prominent. This is also reiterated in the new EU trade policy, of which we also already a bit heard from the previous speaker, and which was launched and with the new Commission, which also stresses very much the importance of open, sustainable, and assertive trade policy. And one of the core objectives there is shaping global rules for a more sustainable and fairer globalization. And the whole idea is that trade should contribute, as we heard, to generating economic benefits, economic growth, productivity, jobs, and others. But also, we should try to take into account some of the negative externalities of trade and try to address those in its trade policy. And the whole idea here is to really try to foster better compliance with already existing international commitments which are related to sustainable development and more broadly to achieving the sustainable development goals. In the rest of my talk, I will briefly focus more on the issue of human rights and labor rights, and focus specifically how the EU is dealing with that in the context of its free trade agreements. In its free trade agreements, and the EU has now already signed several with a very, very prominent, let's say, trading partner. So this constitutes a real important element of the landscape of trade for the moment. The EU tries to integrate human rights and labor rights concerns in two parts of an agreement. First, and I will spend most time on that, are the so-called trade and sustainable development chapters, the TSD chapters, as we also just heard from Ambassador Rokas. But also important to note that the EU includes in every trade agreement, in its first chapter of the trade agreement, which is called the Essential Elements chapter, an explicit reference to human rights, and says in Article 1 of the the chapter on essential elements, that respect for democratic principles and fundamental human rights, as laid down in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and for the principle of rule of law, that's a crucial aspect of every trade agreement, and that actually can lead to a termination or a suspension of a trade agreement in case there are serious violations of human rights. So it's just important to note that these elements of human rights are already included in the essential elements. The essential elements chapter and the provisions therein have not yet been triggered by the EU when there are issues, but symbolically it's very important to understand that the EU attaches a very, let's say, big importance to respect of human rights, democracy, and rule of law in the fundamental parts of the free trade agreements. Next, and most importantly, and we already heard about it, and which is also, I think, very innovative from an EU perspective, is that the EU integrates in its free trade agreements so-called trade and sustainable development chapters. As many as you might know, trade agreements mostly deal with rules on tariffs, competition, non-tariff barriers to trade, all from the perspective of trying to liberalize trade and facilitate trade. But in that series of chapters, which really deal a bit more with the technical core of a trading relation, there's also a very important chapter which is called the Trade and Sustainable Development chapter. And these trade and sustainable development chapters have been an integral part of the EU's FTAs since 2011, so now for a decade. Before that, there were also already references in some EU trade agreements, but let's say the model we are talking about currently, and which is also used in current negotiations, builds on what was developed in 2011 and was expanded from there onwards. Typically, the agreements provide commitments on human and labor rights and on environmental issues, and they try to establish mechanisms and institutions to really foster dialogue and cooperation on these issues to really pursue a further common agenda. Specifically, I think also for the EU free trade agreements is that they actually have quite an elaborate, what we call institutional mechanisms built around the free trade agreements, which are mainly concerned with monitoring and enforcement. And with monitoring and enforcement, we think about provisions in free trade agreements, which allow the parties to see whether progress has been made with regard to certain commitments and what can happen in case of non-compliance and the procedures set out there. The current approach is very much based on an idea of avoiding a race to the bottom and also trying to have a broader scope of issues to address. We already talked about labor and environment, all trade agreements starting to incorporate explicit mentioning to corporate social responsibility and responsible business conduct, sometimes referring to the OECD guidelines in that respect. There are references to voluntary initiatives and the promotion of, let's say, CSR through eco-labeling, fair and ethical trade initiatives, all these types of instruments which are out there, which try to make trade more sustainable. Specifically on labor and human rights, the focus is very much on the ILO core conventions and the ILO fundamental principles and rights at work, which were laid down in the 1998 declaration, and which focus on freedom of association and collective bargaining, forced labor, child labor, discrimination. It also includes references to the promotion of the decent work agenda, which is very much pursued by the International Labour Organization. And just to know, it's very important that you always tries to, let's say, not invent or try to set new standards with regard to labor rights or human rights, but really builds on what has been multilaterally and internationally agreed upon, and in that respect has some kind of a multilateral approach. In order to make sure that parties adhere to these commitments, as I said, the trade agreements develop a set of institutional mechanisms. I'm not going to go into detail here, we can come back to that in case you have questions, but the overall implementation is monitored by a subcommittee on trade and sustainable development, which actually has representatives from each part, and they receive impact from so-called, on the one hand, domestic advisory groups, and on the other hand, civil society dialogue forums, basically external stakeholders which are engaged in monitoring the provisions in a free trade agreement. And in each of the partners in a trade agreement, these domestic advisory groups are set up and civil society dialogue forums are conducted. And the whole idea is that there is some kind of, let's say, a continuous following up how the commitments in a trade and sustainable development chapter are integrated. That's what's there on paper. That's also what the EU is implementing now for a decade, as I said. And of course, a lot of NGOs, a lot of academics, a lot of external observers are following this approach and are also trying to get to grips to what are the effects of the approach. Is it really making an effect? How is it implemented, and so on. And through the last couple of years, quite a lot of reports and papers have been published which look into the current approach and which formulated a number of criticisms which you can find across papers, across analysis. I'm not going to delve into each of them in depth, but there are a few maybe to highlight. One is that there's quite a lot of debate on whether the EU should not use more what we call pre-ratification conditionality, in the sense that the EU should try to foster more the ratification and implementation of international conventions prior to engaging in a free trade agreement, and leave it less to the implementation during a free trade agreement. And we can return to that later on. We also heard just from the ambassador that in the case of Vietnam and also South Korea, actually the implementation and the ratification of ILO conventions which are relevant has been taken up and is followed through. Another criticism focuses on the involvement of civil society and whether the domestic advisory groups are really working and contributing in their monitoring functions. Focus on lack of enforcement, which is now partly addressed by the Chief Enforcement Officer. But overall, there's quite a bit of focus on limited monitoring and limited, let's say, follow-up of recommendations on how to improve the implementation of the trade and sustainable development chapter. Now, this has led over the last couple of years to quite a bit of debate, and the Commission took that debate to heart and is really working on it, and actually initiated an additional debate with a background idea on how to strengthen the current approach of the EU with regard to trade and sustainable development chapters. That was triggered in July 2017 by a so-called non-paper by DG Trade of the European Commission, which tries to set out to understand what are some of the shortcomings of the current approach and how they can be addressed. And after many consultations, after many debates with business associations, with civil society actors, with academics, other experts, and so on, they developed a 15-point action plan, which tries to strengthen the current approach of the trade and sustainable development. And in this 15-point action plan, they list very concrete actions which they want to integrate and already use in the new trade and sustainable development chapters in the free trade agreements they were negotiating and are still negotiating in with partner countries. And 15 points, we'll not go into each of them, but they are grouped by 4 big headings. One is to work more with member states, European parliaments, and international organizations to follow up and monitor the implementation. Very strong emphasis on strengthening and enabling civil society actors to play a role, especially with regard to domestic advisory groups, and to really make sure that business, NGOs, other actors are participating, have the resources to participate, and can contribute to a meaningful monitoring of the implementation of the free trade agreement. So a big element, and there are actually the most action points in capture, is really trying to deliver, trying to further implement. And that includes thinking about early ratification of core conventions. The idea of assertive enforcement really speaks to the idea of the established chief enforcement officer. strengthening compliance with regard to labor conventions, not only those in the 1998 Declaration of Fundamental Principles and Rights, but also maybe think of including additional ones like occupational health and safety and labor inspections. Further capacity building, far more, let's say, regular evaluation, monitoring, and so on. And there the idea is to really step by step try to single out priority areas where improvements can be made. And finally, provisions on transparency and communication, and to ensure that what's been implementing and what's also been, let's say, evaluated is brought more open into the public debate. So I think that's a bit in a nutshell what the EU tries to do with the trade and sustainable development chapters, what they try to do with protecting human rights in free trade agreements, where they are now, and also a bit, I think, already with some of these elements you see here on the slide, what will be some of the points of attention in the next generation of free trade agreements. Thank you very much, and I'm looking very much forward to the debate.
Thank you, Dr. Axel, for the informative coverage on the EU approach, the strategies, and even the criticisms, which I think is important as well for businesses and also civil society, even policymakers to understand so what we can better do to improve and move forward as well. I'm looking forward to having more of your thoughts as well later on the panel discussion. Right, so next we will have, and let me just get my screen up again. Right, we want to welcome Edmund Bond from Edmund Bond Advocates to share with us his perspectives. Really glad that you're able to join us today, Edmund. So let me give a brief introduction. Edmund has been in legal practice for more than 23 years and is a co-founder of Edmund Bond Advocates. He's a specialist counsel who regularly appears in the superior courts in Malaysia to represent individuals and companies on a wide range of cases. Appointed by the Malaysian government in 2016, he was formerly the representative of Malaysia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. Edmund was also previously a 6-time elected member of the Malaysian Bar Council and taught business and human rights to master students at the University of Malaya. Today, we're glad to invite Edmund to speak on aligning priorities and approaches of Malaysian businesses with FTAs. Let's welcome Edmund to share his perspectives. Over to you, Edmund.
Thank you, Charlene, and thank you, BCSD, for inviting me to share some of my thoughts. I have some slides, and can I just screen them up now?
Let us know if you're able to share the slides here, Edmund.
Are you able to have a...
You should be able to, yes. Yeah, if you click the share screen button below.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
Are you able to see the slides?
Not yet. Maybe just give it a while to load. Perfect. We're able to see your slides now. Thank you, Edmund.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. A caveat first, my presentation should not be interpreted as a blanket approval for free trade agreements in all their different forms. Trade agreements, whether regional or global, do impact human rights adversely, and we need to approach them with caution. Every agreement must be scrutinized on a clause-by-clause basis and critiqued as necessary. But trade liberalization brings positive and negative impacts on the environment. And I focus on environment in my discussion today. The growth of economies and expansion will inevitably lead to an increase in pollution or degrade natural resources. At the same time, more incentives and opportunities are made available to support the capacity of companies to improve their management of environmental impacts. Trade and investment in environmental goods and services to improve environmental performance will also increase as parties seek to remove potential barriers imposed on them. Although outside this topic's scope, the controversial investor-state dispute settlement ISDS clause in trade agreements is worth noting. Recently, TC Energy Corporation filed an ISDS claim for more than USD 15 billion against the United States government because the government cancelled the Keystone Oil Pipeline project due to environmental concerns. TCEC is alleging that the government violated the NAFTA, and the ISDS mechanism continues to pose a chilling effect by acting to deter states from complying with human rights, especially when they are in conflict with business interests. Notwithstanding some weaknesses in FTAs, which we must not overlook, some benefits trade agreements bring to the table regarding environmental protection should be considered. 4 points are made. 1, increasing uptake of environmental concerns. We have seen an upward trend in environmental provisions in trade agreements. The OECD tracked the typology of these provisions, and the travel from pre-2008 to 2016 saw a marked increase in the number of agreements that included the provisions. For example, clauses on substantive environmental issues were found in 45 regional trade agreements in 2016 from less than 10 before 2008. And you can see that in the table that I've just showed. I'm just showing now. Why this has happened? It is to ensure that trade liberalization does not damage, but positively contributes to environmental protection. And to achieve that objective, policy coherence between environmental and trade objectives has to be enhanced through commitments in the trade agreements. My second point, driving legal and structural change. The environmental provisions act in another way as a crucial driver for governments and companies to implement environmental policies, regulations, and institutional frameworks. Whether these structural enhancements translate to enhanced environmental protection domestically is still not conclusive though. Numerous local factors are in play on why protection is still deficient despite a legal and regulatory architecture. The impacts are explained in this next slide, which I am sharing. Martinez-Zazoso's empirical study in 2018 found that there is a statistically significant relationship between RTA membership with or without environmental provisions and improved environmental quality for 2 out of 3 of the pollutants investigated, namely sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide. For SO2 and NOx, the magnitude of the effect is slightly larger for agreements with environmental provisions than for those without. But further research is still necessary to substantiate or falsify the link. Be that as it may, trade agreements with environmental provisions provide an opportunity for governments to update their laws, practices, and policies to meet global standards, if there is the political will to do so. Malaysia is due to ratify the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, that strives to promote sustainable development, CSR, and environmental protection and conservation. Chapter 20 on the environment commits state parties to pursue high levels of environmental protection, enforce environmental laws effectively, and promote transparency, accountability, and public participation through consultations regarding environmental matters. While it is arguable that Malaysia meets the basic standards expected, legal and implementation gaps are still in evidence. The Malaysian government's effort to adopt a national action plan on business and human rights, on labor, governance, and environment will hopefully yield results that will heighten the protection of our environmental rights. Unfortunately, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP RCEP, which Malaysia signed and is expected to ratify by the end of 2021, or at least at the latest in the first quarter of 2022, does not expressly emphasize nor advance environmental cooperation and protection. It has no provisions on labor standards or transitions to greener industries. It has been described as a squandered opportunity for trade to advance human rights and environmental protection. My third point, at a more micro level, how do trade agreements impact businesses? Much will depend on how the Malaysian government implements its obligations under the agreements. I use 3 clauses from the CPTPP to explain the point. 2 provisions are mandatory while 1 is voluntary. Articles 20.8 and 20.9 are interesting. They provide for broader participation and scrutiny by the Malaysian public regarding the government's implementation of Chapter 20. the government is obliged to establish a mechanism to respond to requests for information and written submissions filed by the public. If a submission asserts that the government is failing to enforce its environmental laws effectively, other countries may request that a committee on environment discuss the submission. Next, under Article 20.5, the government must take measures to control the production and consumption of substances that can deplete or modify the ozone layer in a manner that results in adverse effects on the environment. Third, Article 20.15 states that transition to low emissions economy depends on domestic circumstances and capabilities. This provision is couched in voluntary terms. Parties are to cooperate, and there's no binding quantifiable indicators for the government to meet. My point is, arguably, the public protection mechanism in Articles 20.8 and 20.9 changes the environmental rights advocacy landscape. Most significant public pressure through the submission process will ensure better accountability from the government in curbing business operations that are detrimental to the environment. In turn, businesses will be compelled to stop harmful practices. Regarding Article 20.5, Malaysia in October 2020 ratified the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer to phase down HFCs by cutting their production and consumption. Regulatory measures to be introduced remains to be seen, but achieving the Kigali target will also satisfy Article 20.5. In terms of non-binding Article 20.15, the question is how far the Malaysian government will engage and work with other governments to accelerate the country's transition to a low emissions economy. Malaysia should embrace the opportunity to build its capacity of its 9 agencies, civil society organizations, and businesses to collectively move ahead on this. But because there are no fixed indicators set under 20.15, it will not be easy to assess the provision's impact on companies. However, I would say that it does not relieve businesses from working towards the transition by having their own environmental goals. In short, the environmental provisions will impact business operations if the government tightens regulations and imposes more stringent measures that companies must take to manage their environmental risks. My final point, what are some of the steps Malaysian companies can adopt to stay ahead of the curve and align their practices with environmental protection? Internally, there's a need to take a longer view of climate risks. Business priorities have to be revamped, not only to comply with legal obligations, but to uncover environmental impacts to be mitigated and recognize that environmental rights are also human rights. Further, the precautionary approach, first mooted in 1992 in the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development should be embedded in every stage of the organization's operations. Action to prevent or avert serious harm to the environment should be taken now and immediately, because delaying action until there is compelling evidence of harm will prove costly, both to avert the harm and repair the business damaged reputation. In summary, 3 key steps are suggested. Evaluate your business environmental risks and opportunities. Common concerns include pollution, emissions, waste management, and the use of natural resources such as water, raw materials, and energy. A human rights due diligence exercise should be conducted to assess the impact of your operations to take action to prevent or mitigate them. Your value chain should be mapped and assessed as well. Where possible, scenario modeling should be done to examine the what if. The modeling will further clarify the risks and opportunities. 2, develop, adopt, and implement your environmental strategy consistent with human rights standards. Post-assessment, set specific and measurable targets as part of your business objectives and environmental strategy. It may include embracing decarbonization as a business opportunity and incorporating carbon removal into your supply chains. Genuine and effective consultative processes must also form a core component of all human rights-based strategies, be it with employees or sensitive receptors, such as nearby residents or indigenous groups whose lives are impacted by business activities. And finally, monitor, evaluate, and report your gains and losses transparently. Investors and consumers are keen to understand how you review and evaluate the organization's human rights compliance and performance. Often used methods include sustainability self-reporting by companies or disclosures to corporate human rights indexes that rate and benchmark companies' performances. The goal must be to regularly communicate the results of these measures, supported by truthful and relevant information for public consumption. Thank you very much for your time, and I hand it back to you, Charlene.
All right, many thanks to Edmund for providing us with all those insights as well. I think it was really useful to hear, especially from the Malaysian legal perspective, especially on some of the steps that Malaysian businesses can take to align their priorities with all of these kind of policies. I'm looking forward to having all your further thoughts as well during the panel discussion later. Right, so now I'm just going to get my slides up again, and we will invite our last speaker for today, Ms. Cynthia Ann Peterson from Petronas, to share with us on assessments and capacity building, taking a balanced approach for a sustainable supply chain. Cynthia is a principal of social performance in Petronas at the group level. She has been in the energy industry for over a decade with international experience in managing social risks across the life cycle of the upstream and the downstream business. She also has experience in developing sustainability strategy and sustainability reporting. We welcome Cynthia today to share on assessments and capacity building, taking a balanced approach for a sustainable supply chain. Cynthia, if you please.
Thank you, Charlene. Thank you very much for giving us the opportunity to talk about this issue from the implementer or the user perspective, which is the business. I'd just like to make three really, I would say, broad points about the impact of human rights and the issue of human rights due diligence in the supply chain. The first thing I'd like to say is that human rights due diligence in the supply chain is something that has grown over the years in terms of its awareness, and the various industries, especially the energy sector, has really taken this on board to try to cascade the risk management approach that we tend to have to our value chain. What we've been seeing is that, as has been elucidated by previous speakers, that there's a growing body of legislation and soft law requirements regarding, especially forced labor. We have noted, there are some mandatory human rights due diligence requirements in some jurisdictions, and so as the issue kind of cascades to players, say in Malaysia, it's really important for companies in the supply chain to really understand that it's not these exposures are there, and it's not something that happens to in Europe, for example. We're all part of a larger value chain. So from the perspective of companies, it's really important to push through this idea and create that awareness, because companies do have a risk-based approach, especially from the energy sector. Human rights due diligence is something that has been happening for quite a while now, and to translate that into the supply chain was a logical next step. As you're probably aware, supply chains tend to be quite complex, and the further down the chain goes, the more and more opaque the view becomes. So there are some real-world challenges regarding and ensuring that respect for human rights is something that a company can definitely push through its value chain. But nevertheless, it's a challenge that the industry, such as for the energy sector, is really looking at. The main point I really wanted to focus on, is really what it takes to enable human rights due diligence to really happen and to eliminate forced labor from the value chain. This comes down to collaboration with contractors and suppliers and partners, and any other collaborator that a company works with. From our experience, what we found was that it was really important to first and foremost create a platform where contractors and the like, can have an open discussion with companies who are in fact their clients. It's really important for everybody within the value chain to understand that taking a work together approach can sometimes be more effective than taking a more punitive approach. So what we found was that several measures do work in concert. So there's no one particular thing that that can resolve this issue. So for example, what we have been doing is from a contractual level, we have included respect for human rights as a contractual obligation. And this will then, sort of daisy chain as the contractors go. We have a contractor code of conduct on human rights, which is also something which sets out the expectations so that when we talk about human rights, it's not really a surprise with contractors. And it's, one of the key challenges really is in terms of understanding what, what is the state of human rights in the value chain. So one of the things that we have been doing quite successfully since 2017 is a contractor self-assessment and sampling assessments by Petronas, just to understand the responses that we receive, and also to get a chance to discuss, what are the challenges that contractors tend to face regarding human rights, and also what are some of the good practices that they do in fact have, because sometimes even very small companies can have some innovative localized practices that could actually be scaled up. Through our self-assessments, a couple of things tend to surface to the top. Really, the understanding of human rights requirements is quite patchy. There's an overall understanding that is important, but how it relates to businesses in the value chain can sometimes require a bit of work. Very small companies, for example, especially if they have fewer than 10 staff, they tend to feel that this is not really an issue for them because human rights is something that big companies need to be concerned about. The other thing is, of course, formalization of processes. For example, grievance mechanisms. They tend to be very informal, and there's no record of what the grievances were. There's no learning from the grievances either. So those are some of the things which tend to surface to the top. The other thing which we did focus on was the aspect of training, and this is one of the key things that we found has worked to try to influence the supply chain in terms of understanding why human rights due diligence is important, and understand why the labor issues are something which we're concerned about. So in Malaysia, for example, if I'm not mistaken, there are 28 labor laws, and there are some under revision, and those are actually, I think, good signs that the laws are currently being updated to ensure that protection of labor is there. But when we talk to contractors, it's quite interesting that the mindset of cost, time, and scope is really top of mind for most contractors. Bringing human rights into the conversation was a little bit strange initially, but over time, they do find that actually they have been, working on human rights issues. It's just that they don't formally call it that. So training really does work. We have a lot of engagements, and we also try to facilitate engagements between authorities and contractors. So for example, we did have a workshop very recently on the revised Act 446 on the minimum standards of worker accommodations and amenities. This was really quite an eye-opener because various things which were in the guideline previously are now enforced in law, but many contractors were either not really aware that it applied to them, or they just weren't sure how, what the expectations were. So, working with contractors to upskill them was really an effort that we have put in. And we have seen some improvements over the last 3 to 4 years. A couple of contractors do come back to and demonstrate that they've improved their internal controls, their internal processes, the recognition that assessment of their subcontractors is also something that they need to do. So this is really a work in progress. The third point I'd really like to make is that COVID-19 has really highlighted some of the gaps that need to be worked on. For a very rather strangely, we do find that somehow or other human rights has been pitted against company survival. This is a kind of a strange phenomena, but from a contractor perspective, it's quite understandable, because some practices have been normalized, even though they go against company requirements, for example. So to shift the conversation from human rights versus company survival to human rights is part of your company survival is one thing that that needs to happen, and a conversation that we've been having with contractors since last year. A couple of other things that we've done is also to put out guidance from a human rights lens on what to do or what we expect in terms of fulfilling our contractor code of conduct and on human rights from a COVID-19 perspective, and also to be to reinforce the requirement of the grievance mechanism, because human rights due diligence is of course one process, but the success of protecting and respecting rights is actually requires a more holistic approach. So grievance mechanism has actually proven to be one of the key mechanisms to identify areas for improvement as well as good practices. In the initial phase, there were some grievances regarding the first MCO. People didn't really understand what some of the provisions were for, but over time we've actually managed to help the contractors see that the grievance mechanism is something that provides value and not just a mechanism to note down grievances. So in a nutshell, human rights due diligence, especially for the supply chain, is something that's here to stay. It will probably grow in sophistication, and there's a great recognition for the complexity of supply chains, especially in sectors such as the energy sector. Collaboration and capability building with contractors is key. It's not going to happen on its own. So in order to collectively raise the standard of human rights in Malaysia, for example, companies do need to work together with their value chain and provide these capacity building initiatives on a regular basis. Thirdly, learning from our experience from COVID-19 is also key to building back better. We did find that in a situation like this, human rights has suddenly become an optional choice between company survival and respecting labor rights, for example. So these are some of the perspectives that need to be retooled. So I'm just going to leave it here, Charlene, and happy to take questions later if there are any. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Cynthia. I think it's really useful to hear, especially from the Malaysian corporate perspective as well. I also do see questions. I believe we could probably tackle this later in the panel discussion as well. So for now, let's maybe take a quick coffee break for about 2 minutes. And then when we come back later, it will be the panel discussion, as well as if we have time, we're going to be looking through some of these questions and some answering them as well. So see everyone in about 2 minutes. Thank you. All right, everyone. I hope you've grabbed your coffee and we're back for our panel discussion. So without much further ado, let's everyone just make yourself comfortable as we begin the panel discussion. But first, let me welcome Ms. Anisha Rajapakse, the Director of Stakeholder Engagement for the Fair Labor Alliance, who will be serving as the panel moderator for the following session. Really great to have you today here with us, Anisha. So let me just give a brief introduction. Anisha is a senior global expert with 2 decades of progressive experience working at the intersection of human rights, business, and international development. Till recently, she was Europe-based, working with corporates, governments, international bodies promoting the business and human rights agenda towards ensuring safe jobs and dignified working conditions. Now relocated to Asia, Anisha is the Director of Stakeholder Engagement at the Fair Labor Alliance, supporting companies to ethically recruit and manage workforces and mitigate risk of illegal and unethical exploitation. We're delighted to have her here today to moderate our panel discussion with her insights and expertise to guide the conversation in a meaningful direction. Just also wanted to introduce Dr. Radu Maresh from RWI, who's going to be joining our panel discussion today with the rest of the speakers. Dr. Radu is a senior researcher at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights. He specialized in the area of business and human rights with a focus on multinational enterprises and global supply chains. His work combines transnational law, corporate governance, and corporate social responsibility perspectives. Now, I could have all the speakers as well. So Dr. Axel, Edmund, and Cynthia, if you could just turn on your videos and get ready for the panel discussion. And I will hand this over to Anisha, who can get started. Thank you, Anisha.
Thanks, Charlene, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here to support BCSD Malaysia and the Raoul Wallenberg Institute for Human Rights and Human Rights Law to moderate this discussion, which is such an important and timely topic. So following on from the excellent and highly informative presentations made in the first half of this webinar, we will now do a bit more of a deep dive to gain further perspectives of trade agreements and the sustainability, human rights, and the environmental imperatives contained therein. So as we heard from the remarks and the presentations earlier, the thinking that trade agreements should include human rights and environmental concerns has been gathering global momentum in recent years. And over the last couple of years, political shifts, the impact of COVID-19, and the efforts for a shared vision of how to build back better have renewed the debate about trade and human rights. Trade agreements have today evolved from being an incentive for trade and transactions between countries through tariffs, quotas, and other agreed clauses to including sustainability, human rights, and business. So business has said that over 80%, the Institute of Human Rights and Business has said that over 80% of all trade agreements signed since 2013 include labor provisions, and that more than 40% of agreements since 2000 include anti-corruption and anti-bribery clauses. It's also important to note that according to the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, specifically Guiding Principle number 9, governments must ensure that trade and investment agreements do not constrain the ability to meet their human rights obligations. This is very important to know. And at the same time, other international bodies such as the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, and the IMF have increased their influence on the capacity of governments to implement human rights obligations. Also, the so-called new generation trade agreements, therefore, have the potential repercussions for companies, given that they demand for more transparency from governments as regards the way that trade policy is formulated and developed. This in turn calls for greater transparency of business practices. As such, the private sector has an important stake in contributing to trade policies which lie at the heart of ensuring the sustainable and inclusive economic growth leading to jobs and wealth creation. However, in order to achieve better economic outcomes resulting from trade and liberalization efforts, businesses cannot and should not be expected to act alone. The systematic considerations of human rights aspects in free trade agreements requires involving all stakeholder groups in preparation, negotiation, and implementation. And some of this was touched on by the previous speakers. And businesses should be a key active stakeholder. Proactive industry associations such as BCSD Malaysia also have a key role to play in encouraging businesses to reference those conventions in their codes of conduct, human rights policies, and supply chain policies and demonstrate how their practices and policies are aligned with those conventions and declarations of FTAs. So what we must remember is that no longer can local businesses overlook the power of trade investment agreements nationally or regionally, as new provisions on human rights, the environment, and sustainable development incorporated in FTAs globally will have the impact on their supply chain governance. So now more than ever, the Malaysian business sector needs to join the race to the top towards ensuring responsible supply chain governance. Easing up trade should not result in easing up on human rights and environmental sustainability. So saying that, we will begin the panel discussion. And given that our time is limited to 30 minutes, I will now direct 2 to 3 questions at our learned panelists. Each will have around 1.5 minutes to respond. And thereafter, we will have the panelists address questions directed to them by this audience. And so to maximize the time that we have, I would like to request that the panelists kindly keep your responses brief and targeted. So let me start off with you, Axel. So today, the calls to build back better also demands for a renewed focus on ways to effectively align trade policies on the SDGs. But some argue that what is currently in FTAs may not adequately address all the potential human rights issues. So they're calling on getting potential trading partners to conduct detailed and systematic human rights impact assessments before the relevant trading agreements are signed. Could you elaborate on what your views would be on this?
Thank you very much, Anisha. Yes, actually, that is one of the debates and criticisms I mentioned in the presentation. And the key issue here is that on the one hand, as I said, all human rights are covered under the essential elements chapter. So in principle, they're all covered. But in the trade and sustainable development chapters, there's always a specific aspect on labor rights, and then specifically on those labor rights which are included in the ILO Declaration of 1998 on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. Now, there is, as you rightly mentioned, a big debate whether that should not be expanded, and we might think of other labor and human rights which should be included more explicitly in the free trade agreement, so that we can also monitor the implementation of those and see whether progress is made. We think about conventions on labor inspection, we think about conventions on health and safety, and these types of issues. And one way to go for that is, as you said, we make a human rights impact assessment, and the key priority areas which emerge from that impact assessment could be taken on board in the free trade agreement. Having said that, one of the reasons why they keep the focus on a specific set of conventions across the different free trade agreements is also, of course, to keep a little bit of a level playing field between all the different free trade agreements which the EU has out there, and not create very big differences between the sustainable development chapters in one trade agreement compared to the other. So that's also one of the rationales behind using this blueprint approach. Thank you.
Thanks, Axel. So what you're also saying is that actually there is more or less synergy between the various, trade, the requirements in the trade agreements on sustainability and human rights and environmental issues, right? It kind of cuts across, it's the same kind of elements that are prevalent in most of the free trade agreements, right?
Yeah, it's a little bit like a blueprint approach. So mentions remain very similar across the different free trade agreements. But as the ambassador said, there are some specific focus areas with regard to some areas, like now the negotiations with Mercosur obviously have a big part on deforestation and forest policy. So there's a bit of variation, but there is a common thread to all free trade agreements.
Okay, thank you, Axel. Cynthia, moving on to you. So you spoke about a bit about this earlier in your comments as well. So understanding commitments under trade agreements can help businesses meet their obligations in terms of compliance and be up to speed on how they can actively advocate and know what the avenues are for advocacy and participation during negotiations. But in reality, could you kind of let us know whether you feel that businesses in Malaysia are active stakeholders in these processes, and are business perspectives given substantial formal representation and inclusion in such negotiations going forward?
Thank you, Anisha. Interesting question. Businesses tend to take, especially large businesses, tend to take a risk-based approach to this question. Whether FTAs or treaties are really top of mind of businesses, to be honest, in the value chain, the question is more about what's the barrier to entry. So in terms of engagements, it's true, businesses do have the feedback from businesses, their challenges and good practices are something that do need to be taken into account, because it does provide a check and balance to whether these requirements expressed in the treaties can actually be implemented. And if so, how would they evolve over time? So yes, in Malaysia, perhaps the thinking, especially from the small and medium industry or enterprise level, might not be thinking, too much about free trade agreements. But the expression of those agreements, requirements, do make their way down to them through requirements of their clients. So it's sort of addressed through that avenue rather than a discussion on trade agreements. But yes, the voice of business is really crucial to provide that feedback on the effectiveness of these requirements in the first place. Yeah.
Thank you, Cynthia. And also when you talk about, the SMEs may not be kind of mainstreamed into the discussions at the moment, increasingly it is important, because with the forthcoming mandatory human rights due diligence of the EU, it goes beyond the first tier suppliers. So it's very important to really be transparent and kind of really assess and know your supply chain, right? And so this includes many of the SMEs.
That's absolutely right. In fact, this is one of the discussions that's the shape of the discussion that's taking place in the industry, because the energy sector is now including the renewable energy space. So you do find that there's a broader spectrum of suppliers and different kinds of conversations that we need to have. And that recognition of the value chain impact is something that the industry is really working on.
Great, thank you for that. Radu, over to you, Radu. So if some trade flows undermine and weaken progress on human rights and environmental goals, what would your perspective be in terms of the steps Malaysian companies could take to make changes?
Thank you, Anisha. Glad to be here. I think the answers were roughly provided by Edmund and Cynthia in their presentations. Those were concrete steps. The answer in one sentence is human rights due diligence. This is the general expectation that we hear from international organizations, from the EU, from national governments. Companies have to respect human rights, and the practical way to do it is by conducting human rights due diligence. And participants have already explained and covered different aspects. If I could give just a few pointers to simplify to the maximum, would be, of course, due diligence. It's not only what happens in your own factory, but what happens in the supplier factories, as well as in the distributors' operations. So due diligence covers the entire supply chain. Due diligence, basically, it's about two things. It's about understanding your impacts, the risks that your operations pose. The second is to take action to eliminate, to minimize those impacts. And this is a classical risk management approach dealing with other financial and business risks. It's risk management leading to continuous improvement in performance and progressive elimination of human rights abuses in the entire supply chain. In terms of the concrete steps, what can be done, I think there are two sets of actions here. So after you identify your impacts, you understand them, you analyze them, you rank them, then it's time to take action. And then action needs to be taken internally within the company, but also looking externally, outwardly. And internally, it's all about improving codes, policies, systems, procedures, so the company is better prepared to handle human rights risks. Looking externally, things become, of course, more complex, and there are issues of supply chain management here. And one very important thing to emphasize is that companies, through their own decisions, their own conduct, can create problems and human rights harms deep in the supply chain. The way that large companies place their orders, they're responsible for that, and the effects are rippling throughout the supply chain in supplier factories. So that's one thing to watch over, how your own conduct is impacting the supply chain. The other thing is how you relate to suppliers, to distributors that are infringing human rights. And this is the issue of leverage, how you influence them. And here I would only point to ideas of shared responsibility, because quite often issues like living wages or child labor are quite systemic. They have very deep roots, and to really tackle at scale this type of issues, you need the ideas of shared responsibility, collective action, working with different actors. So I would stop here and follow the discussion further on.
Thank you, Radu. No, it's very true in terms of collective action, shared responsibility. And again, it's to emphasize that businesses can't tackle this on their own. So there has to be more of a multi-stakeholder approach going forward. So this, your comments also kind of tie in with one of the questions that's already out, and I will include this as well to this. Is, do you feel that Malaysian business entities are really ready for human rights due diligence and supply chain audits? And what is the downside in an FTA of non-compliance if these are provisions included in an FTA? Just briefly, because Edmund will also speak about this a little bit in his question.
Anisha, is the question for me?
Yes, please, Radu.
Okay. Well, I mean, if you ask me if Swedish companies are ready, I wouldn't know what to answer. I would say that some are not. But I think they can get ready much faster than 10 years ago. I think we have a clarity of what is expected from them. There are lots of tools. And if they are not ready, I would say it would be advisable to be ready, because the issue is becoming one of legal compliance. Due diligence is becoming mandatory. We heard about the EU laws. So there is no option. It's just a question about, is it wiser for a company to comply preventively, to be prepared and be ahead of the competitors? Or would they like to wait and see and risk sanctions and action from the investors, from consumers? So that, I think, it's a strategic business decision. But I think the tools are out there, the clarity is enhancing. And I would say that trade agreements and human rights due diligence are two sides of the same coin. Because free trade agreements are agreements between states about conducting trade with values, with respect for labor rights. Due diligence speaks directly to the company. It's a responsibility, perhaps a legal obligation soon. So that's what companies have to do business while respecting human rights and protecting the environment.
Thank you, Radu. So yeah, that's very true. And basically what you're also, I'm assuming you're saying, is also that we need to be more responsive than reactive, right? Because now the legal landscape is closing in, really. So, it's critical that you are responsive rather than just when something blows up and you start scrabbling to see what can be done, right? Right. Edmund, moving on to you, and it's good to see you. We're happy to have you on the panel. So could you kind of say a little bit about what sanctions could mean for businesses in Malaysia, and maybe give an example from learning from country level experience, perhaps?
In terms of violations of...
Yeah, kind of non-compliance, like what would it mean,
Yeah, I think that's a very broad question. If we
Yes.
look at it in terms of the environment, the laws that Malaysia has compared to labor is, I would say, less. The quality as well is not on par with what I think is required. So in terms of labor, we have good laws. We, of course, always have room to improve. Implementation is really poor. And I think there is the problem of overlapping jurisdictions among ministries regarding labor issues in Malaysia. I think that's really clear, and some ministries and agencies would not want to let go their jurisdiction. So that clarity we have been pushing for Malaysian government to decide on. Ministry of Human Resource on one hand, Home Affairs on the other. Sometimes labor issues are seen as security issues as opposed to pure labor issues, labor management issues. I think that's one real big problem. In terms of the environment, the Environmental Quality Act and the regulations, we have, I think, the basic expected standards. But in terms of whether it meets the higher global standards, I think there is much room for improvement. The question as to whether companies are going to be able to comply and what sanctions are there, I think there's a good question in a box which I saw, and that we should make a distinction in Malaysia between companies, multinational companies, larger companies, and SMEs. The ones which are public listed have huge teams, quality auditors, outsourced specialists who are able to help with the audits, who are able to help with the scope of work. Malaysia, I think, should pay some more focus, and civil society should pay some more focus on the SMEs, because in terms of the expertise, in terms of the resources and capacities, to be able to meet some of these obligations like human rights due diligence and supply chain audits, it'll be much more difficult. And whether the tools that are available to these SMEs are currently sufficient is another question. Over to you, Anisha.
Thank you, Edmund. Now, what you're saying is very true, because in discussions I've had with SMEs, when it comes to business and human rights training and human rights due diligence, what I often hear is, but Anisha, what can we do? We don't have big budgets. We don't have big CSR teams. We are like small groups. So what is it that we can do? So they kind of feel that it's a kind of a dead end for them, that they're between a rock and a hard place. But what I kind of believe is the fact that, they cannot take that stance because they are part of the broader supply chain, so it's in their interest to do something. But I completely take your point, the fact that there needs to be more SME-centered kind of tools that would be useful for them so that they can comply, they can, at least address like the low-hanging fruit, right, going forward.
Yeah, I agree. I think the focus on SMEs, the simplification of the tools, the standards need not change, but the simplification of the tools are really required. And I think that's the real gap in the market at the moment.
Definitely. Thank you for that, Edmund. So there's another question that I'm going to actually put to all the panelists, and whoever wishes to respond to it, please go ahead. So today, as you know, many trade agreements take human rights impact into consideration, but the monitoring systems that have emerged up to now are not seen to be very comprehensive. So without robust human rights monitoring, the trading partners have little chance of making sure that their counterparts are meeting their commitments. So what I would like to hear from you is, how do human rights monitoring processes contribute towards ensuring better risk management going forward?
Should I go first?
Yes, Axel, please.
Thank you very much, Anisha. I think monitoring is crucial if you want to follow up how these provisions are implemented. That's one part. And also it's linked to an issue which you also already mentioned in the previous question, which is popping up in the Q&A, is how it can contribute to fostering compliance. And here it needs to feed into, let's say, a whole chain of what we would say implementation, where you make commitments, have enough elements in place to monitor whether the commitments are made. And then the question is, what might happen in case of non-compliance, and when monitoring shows that there is not sufficient, let's say, compliance. So in that chain, monitoring is crucial. And a lot of debates have been held on that on the EU approach. And I think the monitoring in the EU will depend on once using monitoring instruments of international organizations. So more engaging with ILO, more engaging with international conventions on environment and so on. Second, further integrating stakeholders in the monitoring process. And for that, there needs to be capacity, there needs to be resources, there needs to be training. And there's a bit of a debate on who should bear the responsibility there. And I think one of the elements there is that the EU might provide more technical and capacity building resources to enable that. And then, of course, once we have that, we need to see how that feeds into compliance. And here, as we know that in free trade agreements, there's not a very strong compliance instrument. It's not like in the US trade agreements where you have fines, where you maybe have suspensions. And that relates to the whole debate on whether we should include sanctions in free trade agreements or not to foster compliance. But that's actually quite a difficult debate because we don't have much evidence that strong sanctions and compliance mechanisms really contribute to better human rights protection. So that would be my approach to this.
Thank you, Axel. And this kind of leads in also to another question that has come up in terms of the fact that you talked about to fulfill the obligations that generally funds are given, and so developed trade partners like the US and the EU do provide developing country governments on capacity building and so on. So how would you feel that businesses can avail, Malaysia, for example, in case in point, can avail of such allocated support? And any one of the panelists, please feel free to respond.
Perhaps I can chip in on that. After spending about 3 years with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and seeing how dialogue partners and the capacity that the available opportunities of potential and capacity with larger dialogue partners, the European Union, Americans, Swedish, there is actually a lot of opportunities for our private sector and businesses to up their game and build their capacities. There are a lot of opportunities because there are many technical arrangements, technical support programs. And that's why I post in my paper, the real problem, I think, is that there is a bureaucracy gap or block sometimes at the ministries and agencies on how to get these things going on scale level. One, I think sometimes there is a huge fear, and especially in ASEAN with a lot of different countries, not just Malaysia, there's a huge fear that so a lot of these human rights dialogue programs or technical support programs for a certain reason or for a certain agenda. And that always comes up, and it takes a lot of time for Malaysian and other countries in ASEAN to actually get socialized towards that. I think that's very important. The second point is that while there is that kind of support, whether through funding or technical support, there is a fear that it becomes a proliferation of time and resources on already very stretched agencies locally. So if you imagine that even Malaysia, I know for a fact that a lot of the agencies are very stretched in terms of time and resources. Imagine a country like Laos, or even a country like a smaller country than us. So in terms of how do we make sure that there's no overlap, how do we make sure that the programs are effective, that is not just being done for the sake of being done, is the real challenge. And I think the next layer is, to what extent do these trickle down to businesses and civil society? A lot of these programs are done at a very high elite level, and we see that they do not trickle down enough because people on the table usually are either senior officials from the ministry or from local agencies, and there's not enough involvement with the businesses. I think the businesses in Malaysia are only starting to slowly get used to this idea of business and human rights, because Malaysia has sort of domesticated this idea that we need a national action plan on business and human rights.
Thank you, Edmund. That's very true. And also, like, I think it's not just limited to Malaysia, because basically what's needed in a lot of the developing countries in the region is like, there has to be more of a harmonized response between the relevant or the different government ministries, because everything is like very ad hoc. And as you say, like the awareness levels on these things is also ad hoc. And, you know, it's kind of, yeah, there's like, it's, a lot of it is also kind of top down, because it also comes from international organizations, but how it's kind of translated and, as you said, trickle down to the businesses of different levels, because as you know, like the big players already, you know most of these things are kind of in their DNA, because they've had to, you know, they built up their reputation based on that. But it's the smaller ones and not the usual suspects who need a lot of the help, right, going forward.
Yes, can I pick
Yes,
in just for the small point also related to what Radu said, is that specifically with regard to human rights due diligence legislation and regulation, it's important to understand that there's a real, let's say, development in that respect, especially also in Europe. The Commission will make a proposal, that's one, but there are already some countries which have very far-going legislations in place. The Dutch have the regulation on preventing child labor. The French have a duty of diligence law and these types of things. And the common thread is they all put due diligence requirements on companies. And that really goes down the value chain. And these due diligence requirements can have very severe and quick consequences. To give you one example, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when there were food crises in Europe, the UK developed a law which put due diligence requirements on food retailers. And that actually meant that throughout their value chain, they had to put systems in place to check quality, safety, and things of food. And these due diligence systems spilled completely over to the producers. And there were some countries and some producers in some countries which could not comply with the due diligence requirements. And one of these requirements was, for example, to get certification by a certain certification body. And they lost their export markets basically overnight. And they lost a lot of revenues just because they were no longer able to access value chains. And one should not underestimate the potential impact of these due diligence requirements on a lot of players around the world. And that brings me to the final point, in the sense that this is, of course, important for businesses to be aware of. But as you rightly pointed out, it also is a government responsibility to really start thinking about how can we prepare our businesses, how can we prepare our entrepreneurs to these challenges. And we think about training, we think about capacity building, we might even think about certain subsidy programs to really get people up to speed in order to not only remain in value chains, but also maybe to expand their potential export. And from that perspective, the developments which are ongoing here might spill over quite quickly to a lot of producers in Asian countries.
Thank you, Axel. That's very true. And Radu, Radu, go ahead.
If I could add, because I think that there were 2 points I wanted to stress here. Mm-hmm. What Axel said, that actually it's possible to narrow down and prioritize and break down this huge complexity. And the issue of trickling down, I think it's also very, very important. I mean, I can totally understand the smaller business, perhaps even bigger ones that struggle to understand what is this whole thing about business and human rights and due diligence. It's a new topic, it's huge, it covers all industries, all human rights. So it's a lot of content there, so it can be overwhelming. In the same time, talking about capacity building, there is lots of training available there, whether it comes from business associations like the Business Council, or perhaps from the buyers for the big brands that are very keen to train their suppliers. Also, the policy makers, governments, the European Commission are very eager to issue guidance, even create exemptions from compliance for very small companies, and so on. I would say that small SMEs, parts of global supply chains, already deal, for example, rules of origin, right? So very technical issues about their role in the global supply chains. Those, I would say, are even more complex than some aspects of complying with human rights. So I think one of the gains of the human rights due diligence approach is that it really allows you to break down complexity and actually prioritize the impacts, the actions that need to be taken. And once they are broken down in dozens of parts, then I think they become much easier to manage.
Very true. Thank you very much, Radu. Really interesting. And Cynthia, there's a question that's come to you as well from the audience. So as a leading Malaysian company, what kind of assistance do you think you would need in order to be able to better implement human rights and environmental clauses in trade agreements going forward? Has Petronas moved on any of these requirements?
Thank you for that question. I would say that maybe picking up from the points that Dr. Radu just made, it's not really the assistance that a company like Petronas would need, but it's probably, kind of a systemic value chain approach for how to trickle these trade agreements requirements down to the grassroots level at the SME level. So perhaps, some support for companies that do in fact train their value chain would certainly be helpful, because what companies like ours do is we break down the requirements into actionable steps. I think SMEs just need actionable steps. So for example, what we do for grievance mechanism is to say, have a grievance mechanism. This is the minimum of what it needs to look like. And you'll be surprised that it's not as well understood as, the term grievance mechanism is not as well understood as we think it is. So, what companies tend to do in their trainings is really to break it down into, some priority areas that need to be addressed. But to roll that up, into ultimately complying with requirements that are in agreements is something which is, which needs to be thought through, from a systemic level. So maybe there is a break between what could be offered by, say, the EU or relevant ministries in terms of trainings, but companies themselves have taken the initiative to do that based on the risks that they face. The last point I would just like to make is that for the energy sector, the issue is quite interesting because where we find elevated risks of labor and other human rights, potential issues is really more in the subcontractor level and beyond. So our immediate contractors would probably not be, the risk of it would probably be relatively low. This is for the energy sector. So it's slightly different from agriculture or maybe other industries where it's relatively visible how that might look like. So there, in terms of capacity building and training, there are several layers that, in fact, that need to be addressed in a more consistent level. It's really the contractors themselves, and then to enable them or to at least provide some tools for them to train their own value chain. So it tends to have that multiplier effect. In the ideal world, everybody would have the same sort of understanding after going through a couple of rounds of trainings, but we know that that's not really something that happens. So it's more consistently ensuring that this approach is there, and perhaps recognizing that there is a grassroots level here that tends to have an impact on fulfilling the trade agreements, but they're not necessarily talking about trade agreements when they're thinking about human rights.
Yes, thank you, Cynthia. And as you say, also, there isn't, to reach the supply chains, down the line, kind of having a template training does not work, because it varies from sector to sector, but at the same time, it's more about the awareness, right? In terms of what are the salient risks, as we know it, like how does it apply, right? So that is quite critical. And just want to also find out, like, what are your thoughts on this? The fact, like, do suppliers and contractors view human rights as a challenge or an opportunity to winning contracts?
Well, during this COVID period, it's more of a hurdle. But then again, as I mentioned earlier, some practices of non-compliance have been normalized. So when Malaysia, for example, revised its minimum standards on worker housing and amenities, the issue of which is a requirement that the EU has had for a while, in terms of personal space, the 4 meter square personal space that you need to have, is all of a sudden, something of an issue. So there are those really granular level types of issues that that contractors do face. And it's more, going back to the earlier points, raised by the panel as well, it's more an issue. I think a more effective approach is working with, rather than saying you need to meet the 4 meter square requirement, because in order for it to be sustainable, businesses of various sizes need to understand that, this is actually for the benefit, for a long-term sustainable benefit.
Exactly. Thank you, Cynthia. And there's like one, because we are running out of time, so there's one last question actually. So as many of you know, there are other human rights and sustainability monitoring mechanisms that the EU has, such as the GSP plus schemes. And just, from a personal standpoint, for example, at the moment, the EU Commission is considering a temporary withdrawal of GSP plus trade concessions to Sri Lanka. The GSP plus scheme is conditional on Sri Lanka advancing human and labor rights and working towards sustainable development. And GSP plus is currently being used as a leverage by highlighting the need for advancement on the country's human rights obligations. And any such withdrawal, as you can imagine, would be hugely challenging prospect for industries that are direct beneficiaries of the GSP plus concessions, and will undoubtedly lead to job losses, affect the country's competitiveness in global markets, and impact on foreign exchange earnings. So what do you think are the lessons that can be drawn upon these to improve human rights monitoring of future trade agreements and schemes for Malaysia? Yes, Axel.
On the GSP, it's a very good question, Anisha, and it's also a very sensitive question in the sense that the EU has not much leverage in terms of addressing non-compliance, except for using very strong non-compliance sanctions, and that's the withdrawal of preferences. And as you rightly mentioned, that will hurt not only the government, but also many businesses and many people working in businesses. And whether that types of sanctions is working or not is actually quite a bit of a debate on, because sometimes if we see that withdrawing these preferences does not always lead to better human rights protection afterwards. So I think one should be careful in considering what would be appropriate sanctions in case of non-compliance. And so if we want to link the debate of the GSP to the debate on the FTA, it's for me not a straightforward, let's say, case to apply the sanction mechanism which is embedded in the GSP to the FTAs. I think we would need more refined, more targeted sanctioning regime if we really want to think about an enforcement mechanism and a sanctioning regime coupled to non-compliance of human rights protection.
Yes, thank you, Axel. And yes, definitely, like, whether in actuality the carrot and stick approach would work or not remains to be seen, and there are other ways of trying to achieve the necessary results, right? Right. So
Anisha,
Yes, Radu, please.
Add just one or two sentences here. We heard from His Excellency, the EU Ambassador, that 2 days ago, the European Commission proposed an updated, a reviewed version of the GSP kicking in beginning of 2024 for the next 10 years afterwards. And one of the changes, one of the improvements is especially this idea of having a special assessment of the economic social impacts of the withdrawal. So it's not done hastily and with unintended effects. And during the consultation process the Commission ran, a very interesting idea was to create an exemption from withdrawal in the withdrawal context for operators that do due diligence. So individual companies that really make an effort to comply, how would they be hit by this withdrawal, and whether an exception should be created for them so they can continue to be part of the global supply chains. Unfortunately, as far as I could see, reading quickly through the Commission draft, this proposal was not taken up.
Right, that's very interesting, and it's true. I mean, you know, it's a challenging way of going about it, really. But it's good that the situation is tightening. But at the same time, it has to work for businesses as well. And with the mandatory human rights due diligence coming into play, it's also to ensure that businesses are translating their human rights policies into tangible actions, really. Because very often it sits with papers and reports and annual reports and so on, and the declarations are there, but how are they actually working on the ground? How is it being implemented? And I guess greater scrutiny of that going forward, even with GSP Plus, probably would definitely help, right? Great. So I think we've kind of coming to the end of our panel session, but since I've already been speaking with you all on this, I think it might be better if I give the floor to each of you in terms of a couple of last comments that you would like to share with the audience before we wind up, and I hand it over to Charlene. Cynthia, would you like to start?
Sure, thank you. The one comment I would like to make is that, you know, working together with contractors and suppliers is really the key to ensuring human rights is respected. And understanding, you know, their challenges would definitely enable, you know, companies and perhaps governments later to, you know, have policies and processes that actually work on the ground. So that's my comment.
Thank you, Cynthia. Edmund, would you like to go next?
Yeah, thank you. I just want to add that one form of pressure is public pressure. Today, companies, businesses cannot run away from the fact that the new media, social media, is extremely powerful. And of course, there are a lot of unwarranted comments that are made about businesses and how they are treated. But there are also a lot of information that goes around that are genuine and legitimate. And businesses cannot run and hide from a lot of these genuine complaints. And it's better to deal with these things because they will really just affect your business. I've just presented how, in terms of the environment, the government ought to have a public feedback mechanism, and that would allow civil society organizations to have more access to information. That would allow civil society organizations and the public to complain about how the government treats the environment. And I think that's a new way to go in terms of pressure, in terms of getting things to change. Thank you.
Thanks, Edmund. So yeah, very true in terms of the fact that, you know, in this brave new world, we're living in an era of hyper transparency. So there is very little room to escape. So there is greater scrutiny, and whether you talk about you know, fishermen out in the waters or whatever, everybody has a smartphone, you know, nowadays. So it is very easy. So it's better to be prepared for the consequences of all that. Radu, Axel, which one of you would like to speak next?
Anisha, I actually prepared for the 1 minute last pitch, what you just at the end. Be prepared.
Sorry.
And the message we are giving, especially also maybe from a European perspective, is that there are many different developments, whether we talk about GSP, free trade agreements, human rights due diligence, other types of regulations. they all affect global value chains. And if you as a company want to be part of global value chains, you really need to think about it and reflect on how you can manage your company accordingly. And that will mean that being prepared is the key issue or the key message, maybe take away.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Axel. Radu, would you like to?
Yes, I would imitate Axel in this respect, and I would say be informed. The thing is that the European Commission has commissioned actually a very large study, comparative empirical study on free trade agreements, US, EU, and many other countries, just to understand empirically, but also based on a vast literature, what is the design of free trade agreements, what's the institutional mechanism, what are their effects, the impacts in practice. And this, I think, is gonna be very important work, very interesting, one of the largest studies, and it should be out by the end of the year, so in the coming months. I look forward to reading that.
Thank you. Yes, so do I. So with that, thank you so much, each of you. I think this is a really interesting conversation, and I think we could have gone on for a lot longer, but time constraints prevent us from doing that at the moment. But thanks very much for all of your input. I found it very stimulating as well to be moderating this session. And I will now hand it over to Charlene to close this webinar. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much, Anisha. I also see that our executive director, Mr. Roberto Benetello, is with us as well. Roberto, do you have a few words to share? Otherwise, I'll move to the closing. Yeah.
No, thank you, Charlene. It was a very, very interesting discussion. I followed that with a lot of interest. So yeah, over to you for the closing.
Right, thank you. Just wanted to thank everyone, all of our speakers and panelists for your engagement in this very exciting discussion. Thank you so much to Anisha as well for leading this in a great direction. I think just wanted to pick up on a point that you made about Anisha, you mentioned about making tangible, changes or concrete approaches, which I think is also really key in understanding how businesses, can align themselves in the area of human rights and environmental concerns. I think this has been a really informative discussion. Thank you all for being here for this productive session. There are some questions I noticed that we didn't manage to tackle. Sorry about that in the interest of time. However, I would also like to point out that we have further sessions planned. For example, there was a question on blockchain solution, topics like digitalization and technology, how this is going to be helpful to help businesses align themselves with human rights concerns. These are all topics that we'll be interested in exploring for some of our future events. As mentioned, BCSD Malaysia is partnering with the Raoul Wallenberg Institute of Human Rights and Humanitarian Law on this Business for Human Rights and the Environment in Malaysia platform. Today's webinar is again part of this initiative. This platform is going to be focusing on reinforcing large companies' knowledge of the international, regional, and national law and policy frameworks in Malaysia, Southeast Asia, and internationally. This will enable companies to identify and effectively describe risks and tensions in realizing human rights in environmental protection and climate change contexts, as well as to rethink and adopt, again, tangible or concrete new strategies and approaches as highlighted by our many speakers today, to better embed the right to a healthy environment into their respective mandates. If you're interested in learning more about this platform, please, you could let us know via the chat box. Otherwise, kindly follow us on our social media, stay in touch. We'll be getting in touch with you soon as well. And stay home, stay safe, and we'll see you again for the next section. Thank you for your time.